when two fortress traditions collided, the Siege of Albazin, 1686. In the summer of 1686, a small wooden fortress on the banks of the Amur River became the site of an unusual experiment, one neither side intended, and one that ended up testing two completely different military engineering traditions against each other in real time. On one side of the walls, a garrison of Russian Cossacks defending a fort built loosely on European bastion principles. On the other, a Qing dynasty army that had spent centuries refining siege warfare along an entirely separate technological path, shaped by different enemies, different terrain, and a fundamentally different theory of what a fortress wall was actually for. Neither tradition was primitive, neither was simply behind the other. They had just solved the same basic problem. How do you build something that keeps an army out, using different starting assumptions? And Albazin is one of the clearest places in history where you can watch those assumptions collide directly. Part 1, two different problems. To understand why Albazin turned out the way it did, you have to understand that European and East Asian fortification traditions weren't really competing to solve the same problem. They were solving different problems that happened to look similar on the surface. European bastion trace fortresses, the kind we've covered before, full of angular projecting bastions, ravelins, and sloped earthen glacis, were built primarily as an answer to gunpowder artillery used by other European powers with comparably advanced cannon technology. The entire trace italienne system exists to eliminate dead zones and absorb high-velocity iron shot fired at relatively close range by guns not meaningfully different from the ones inside the fortress itself. It's an arms race between symmetrical opponents, and the architecture reflects that. Precise, mathematical, obsessed with angles because the enemy's cannons were just as good as yours. And geometry was the only edge available. Chinese and Manchu siege tradition developed under different pressures. For centuries, Chinese fortification had to account for enormous scale. Walls protecting entire cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, built and rebuilt across dynasties, often facing enemies who relied more heavily on cavalry mobility, overwhelming manpower, siege towers, and tunneling than on artillery duels between evenly matched cannon. Chinese engineers had access to gunpowder centuries before Europe did, and used it in sieges long before European armies did. But the doctrine that grew up around it prioritized different things. Massive rammed earth walls, thick enough to shrug off most bombardment without needing angular bastions at all, combined with overwhelming numerical superiority, logistics, and patience as the primary siege-breaking tools rather than precision gunnery. By the time these two traditions actually met at Albazin, in other words, you had a Russian-built fort designed to resist an artillery duel against peer opponents, facing a Qing military that had perfected an entirely different approach. Siege through encirclement, attrition, overwhelming force concentration, and, as it turned out, some genuinely severe firepower of its own. Part 2, what Albazin actually was. It's worth being honest about scale here, because Albazin was not Neuf-Brisach. It was a frontier stockade, a Russian Cossack outpost on the Amur River, rebuilt in the 1680s with earthen ramparts and wooden palisade walls, reinforced with some bastion-style angular projections to allow flanking fire, but built quickly, cheaply, and far from the resources of European Russia. It housed a garrison that at various points numbered somewhere in the low hundreds, supported by a modest number of cannon. This matters because it means Albazin wasn't a true test of the full trace Italienne system at its best. It was a rough frontier adaptation of bastion principles, built with local timber and earth rather than the dressed stone and precisely surveyed angles of a Vauban fortress. What it did retain, though, was the core geometric idea. Angular projections designed to give defenders flanking fire along the wall face, rather than the round towers and dead zones that had made medieval fortifications so vulnerable centuries earlier in Europe. Facing it was a Qing army under commanders operating with the full institutional weight of one of the most sophisticated siege traditions in the world at that point. An army that had, within living memory, besieged and taken far larger and more heavily fortified Chinese cities using massed artillery, sapping, and sheer weight of numbers. Part 3, the Qing approach to the wall. The first Qing siege of Albazin, in 1685, demonstrates the East Asian approach clearly, rather than attempting the kind of slow, geometric approach trench siegecraft that a Vauban-trained European engineer would have used against a pier fortress. Qing forces relied heavily on direct bombardment with a substantial artillery train, applied with enough concentrated force to make the garrison's position untenable relatively quickly, followed by negotiated surrender rather than a prolonged battle of engineering attrition. This is a genuinely important difference in doctrine, not just circumstance. European siege warfare against a well-built star fort, as we've covered, was often a matter of months, precisely because both sides were playing the same geometric game, trying to deny each other angles, digging zigzag approach trenches specifically because a direct assault against functioning bastions was suicidal. Qing commanders at Albazin, facing a much smaller and more improvised fortification, didn't need to play that game. Overwhelming artillery concentration against a modest earthen and timber wall didn't require elegant trench geometry. It required enough guns, enough powder, and the logistical capacity to sustain a bombardment, all of which the Qing military, backed by the resources of one of the largest states on Earth, had in considerable abundance. The second siege, in 1686, after the Russians reoccupied and rebuilt the fort, shows the encirclement side of the doctrine even more clearly. Rather than repeating a short, artillery-heavy assault, Qing forces settled into a prolonged blockade, surrounding the fortress, cutting off supply and reinforcement, and letting disease, starvation, and attrition do work that direct assault against improved defenses might have made costly. This is not a lesser strategy than European approach trench siegecraft. It's a different one, optimized for an army with the manpower and logistical depth to sustain a long encirclement rather than needing to force a quick engineering breakthrough. Part 4, where the fort's design actually mattered. Here's where the comparison gets genuinely interesting from an engineering standpoint rather than just a narrative one. Even in its rough frontier form, Albazin's angular bastion elements appear to have done real work during the fighting. Russian accounts describe the ability to bring flanking fire along wall sections during Qing assaults, exactly the kind of coverage that a round-towered medieval-style stockade would not have provided. The garrison's cannon, though limited in number, were positioned to exploit those angles. What the fort's design couldn't compensate for was scale and depth. European bastion trace theory assumes a fortress substantial enough to force an attacker into a slow, methodical siege. Thick enough ramparts, a real ravelin-protected ditch, a proper glacis denying elevated firing positions. Albazin, built quickly on a frontier with limited labor and no dressed stone, had the angular geometry without the mass behind it. Against a pure European artillery train, that geometry alone might have bought real time. Against Qing siege guns deployed in numbers and calibers that frontier Russia struggled to match, the geometry helped, but it couldn't substitute for the sheer bulk of earth and stone that made fortresses like Naarden or Neuf-Brisach so difficult to crack even after months of proper approach trench siegecraft. This is really the core lesson Albazin offers. Bastion geometry solves a specific, narrow problem, eliminating dead zones and enabling flanking fire extremely well, regardless of who's using it or against whom. But it was never, on its own, the whole reason European star forts were so hard to take. It was one layer in a system that also depended on scale, depth, and the attacker being forced to fight the fortress's chosen game, rather than simply overwhelming it. Take away the scale and depth, as frontier conditions did at Albazin, and the geometry alone, however elegant, runs into the much older and blunter military logic of sufficient force concentration. Part 5. What happened to the garrison? By late 1686, the second siege had settled into exactly the kind of grinding encirclement Qing doctrine favored. The Russian garrison, cut off and reduced by disease and casualties to a fraction of its original strength, held on through the winter. A genuinely remarkable feat of endurance, whatever the eventual outcome, and one that speaks to how much a determined, well-led defense can extract even from an imperfect fortification. The siege ultimately ended not through a final assault, but through diplomacy. The broader Russo-Qing border dispute that Albazin sat at the center of was being negotiated at a state level even as the siege dragged on, and the fortress's fate became tied to those negotiations rather than resolved purely on the battlefield. The eventual Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 settled the border question and with it Albazin's fate, with the fortress ultimately dismantled as part of the agreement. That ending matters for understanding the engineering lesson here, because it means Albazin wasn't a case of one fortification tradition definitively beating the other in open combat. It was a case where a scaled-down, frontier version of one tradition met the full institutional weight of another, held out longer than its size probably should have allowed, thanks to genuine defensive engineering, and was ultimately resolved by factors, diplomacy, logistics, the sheer scale of the Qing state. That had very little to do with wall geometry at all. Part 6. What the comparison actually tells you. Step back from the specific siege, and Albazin becomes a useful lens for a broader point about military engineering across cultures. Geometry solves geometric problems. Angular bastions eliminate dead zones. Thick, rammed earth walls absorb bombardment through sheer mass. Encirclement defeats a garrison through attrition rather than assault. None of these approaches is objectively superior in the abstract. Each is a rational response to a specific set of threats, available resources, and strategic goals, refined over generations by engineers and commanders solving the problems actually in front of them. What makes Albazin worth studying isn't that it proves European fortification was better, or that Qing siegecraft was better. It's that it shows what happens when those two independently developed, internally coherent systems meet under conditions that favor one side's underlying assumptions, overwhelming force and sustainable encirclement, over the other's. Geometric precision against a symmetrically matched opponent. The bastion held up exactly as well as bastion geometry should have. It just wasn't fighting the kind of siege bastion geometry was originally built to win.